I'm Ann Schuster. I'm the education specialist for the Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board. My background is in environmental outreach and restoration. So I'm going to go through really briefly laws, listing process, the classifications of weeds, some resources on how to identify weeds, then get more into how weeds impact everyone, us, our resources, and how to get involved and help the situation. So the Noxious Weed Board basically updates the weed law and the weed list. There's some elected members, and there's some members that are appointed by WSDA because we are underneath WSDA kind of umbrella in a way. The weed law has been in place since 1975, but there are some weed laws that go back earlier than that, like 1895 there's a noxious weed law for just Canada thistle, and we all know how that turned out. There's Canada thistle everywhere. We administer at the Noxious Weed Board the noxious weed list. There's also the prohibited plants list, which is administered by the Department of Agriculture, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Right now, until the end of the week, is when anybody can propose species or changes to the noxious weed list. After April 30th is when the Noxious Weed Committee goes through those proposals and researches them for a public hearing and then a final vote in November for the weed list to take effect in January. So there's a few more days. If anybody has a change to the weed list, that means additions, uplistings, downlistings, delistings, any of the above. So counties have like 90 days after the weed list gets updated to make their own weed list. They have to take all of the Class A's as well as some Class B's that are designated in their area, and then other things that they choose to take, basically. And a lot of times those are Class C's and other plants that they're usually choosing for education purposes, sometimes tree of heaven, things like that. So Class A weeds are the highest priority weed species to control. They're required for eradication within a calendar year finding them, unless an agreement is come to. All these plants are automatically added to that prohibited plants list by the WSDA. And these are usually plants that are rarer or aren't in Washington yet and pose great threat to Washington. Class B weeds are a little bit confusing. They're kind of like halfway between A and C. In some parts of the state, they'll be treated like Class C, where they're not required for control. And in other parts of the state, they'll be treated kind of like a Class A, where they're required for control. And that's usually in places where there's not many of them. So Scotch broom is a lot more rare in Eastern Washington. So a lot of those places have it required for control because it's actually still feasible to control it in a lot of those places. Class C weeds are the most widespread for the most part, perhaps more easy to control, and they're everywhere. A lot of places don't require them for control. If they've selected it for their own county list, that's up to them. But this Canada thistle is an example where it's just in really high populations all over the state. The monitor list doesn't have any sort of legal background to it. It's just so that we can gather more information for potential listing in the future. We're just relying on the public and practitioners out there to, if they see a plant, report it to the sponsor of that plant. And then every few years we'll look at the list and decide if things should be put on the list or not. Then the quarantine list or the prohibited plants list is the list that's administered by WSDA rather than the Weed Control Board. That's plants that are not allowed to be sold in Washington at all. A lot of the plants on that list are on the noxious weed list, but others aren't. A lot of the ones that aren't are problems in like the aquatics aquarium industry, things that might not be a problem if they were to get out into the wild, but would be a problem in the industry. So these are some resources for weed control and also weed ID. Right now our website is down. I just found out this morning. Hopefully it'll be back up by the end of the day. But your county weed board, your local WSU extension office, the Washington Invasive Species Council, as you all have heard from, Also, your local conservation district, depending on where you live, might be able to assist. I really like the Burke Herbarium image collection for identifying plants. It just got back up. It was hacked in like December and has been down for the past few months, but I'm really happy it's back. I don't have a whole lot of luck with those AI apps to identify plants, but if you do, good for you. Double check what it's identifying the plant as. So in these last few minutes, I want to just go over some of the ways that noxious weeds really impact all of us and everything we do, our resources, things we rely on. So first, that a lot of weeds are bad for humans. Sometimes they're bad for our health, like toxic species, like those burns on that bottom picture from giant hogweed. Spines and thorns obviously don't feel good to get in your skin, but also they do reduce property values depending on where you are in the species. They can damage infrastructure. So in that bottom corner, that's a picture of English ivy that's climbing all over that power line. So that can definitely cause problems, especially like in a windstorm. They harbor pest species. For instance, I'm sure we've all heard about spotted lanternfly that tends to like tree of heaven at one point in its life cycle. And then they also reduce visibility and access to our roads. So there's a picture of Scotch broom that DOT tries to keep back and manage, but they are very short-funded and short-staffed. So if we can take care of noxious weeds, we can help them out. Noxious weeds are bad for livestock and generally any animal like species that we're going to enjoy or want to have around. So it includes wildlife, fish, all sorts of things. There are toxic species. So that cow did die from ingesting poison hemlock, and poison hemlock is deadly even after it's been cut and dried in a field or put into hay. Spines and thorns will hurt the animals, and if animals are being raised for like leather, that'll damage their skin. It also reduces forage, so it just makes it harder for livestock and other animals to eat and have the amount of food they need. Tansy ragwort down there in the bottom corner is toxic to lots of livestock, and that was the amount removed from like one horse farm. So that's a lot. They also harm agriculture. They really reduce, like I said, livestock forage and their range. They tend to increase herbicide use for the farmers, and that increases cost for the farmers, as well as if it sprays onto a field nearby or residue on foods if it's not washed well. It also increases time doing manual control for species that don't react well to herbicide. And both of those things increase food prices because they increase the amount of time and effort that the farmers are working with. They can also clog irrigation networks like that yellow flag iris down there in the bottom corner. And once again, they harbor pest species that can be harmful to agriculture. So spotted lanternfly will cause a massive amount of economic damage to Washington's agriculture when it gets here. They harm forestry. They damage trees. So that's English ivy in the bottom corner climbing up that tree, and that tree is dead or almost dead from being choked out by that English ivy. They hinder timber harvesting. They just make it harder to get in there and get the trees. They interfere with timberland reforestation. So like things like holly, for instance, will shoot off berries a lot after a logging operation and do really well in that area, and then will make it harder to reforest that location afterwards. They also increase the herbicide use and time doing manual control for the foresters, so that increases the cost of forestry. They harm the environment. They reduce biodiversity. So in that picture in that top corner is Oriental clematis. You can imagine that there's absolutely no other plant growing underneath that Oriental clematis all over that riverside. They reduce habitat quality. In that lower picture is purple loosestrife taking over an entire wetland. And so that wetland now no longer has quite as good habitat for waterfowl, for fish, for frogs, just because of that purple loosestrife really taking over. There's soil erosion problems, especially when the invasive plants kill back the native plants that are really holding onto soil. And they can be particularly harmful to aquatic habitats for things like salmon. If they're killing off trees, that will raise the light level in the water, creating just bad temperature for salmon fry and roe to live in. The erosion on the soil will cause problems because then the fish won't be able to breathe and move and live as well, and the insects they rely on won't be able to survive as well either. These invasive species tend to hinder recreation. Since they harm wildlife and they harm fish, that does reduce hunting opportunities. It lowers fishing ability and yield. It does make for dangerous hiking, biking, kayaking, depending on where you're going. The wildlife you might not be able to watch as well if there's just no birds in that wetland you went to go look for birds in. The aquatic species can get spread from location to location on boats very easily, and then makes it difficult to swim. I wouldn't want to swim through that milfoil, and I wouldn't want to ride my bike through a puncture vine area. Actually, I know I wouldn't because I grew up with it in New Mexico.
And you have about 4 minutes left.
Oh, I was trying to get done at 9:20.
Perfect.
Okay, I'm almost done actually. So I think this is like the last real slide. So they also increase fire hazards. So some species burn really fast. They add a lot of dry biomass to act as fuel. They can really act as a ladder fuel to the forest crown. So holly is especially bad at this because it's pretty oily and it's a very intermediate height from the forest floor to the crown. So it can very much act as a ladder to the crown. They also tend to be quick to infest after disturbance. So that thistle is just absolutely infesting that area that has been burned that wasn't replanted after the burn. So how can you help all these problems? It'd be great if everyone can learn about invasive plants, especially how to identify them and control them. When you get the chance, control them on your property or volunteer with a group that does control. So maybe with a tribe or a nonprofit or a government agency. It's great to teach others because then we can spread it through the community and through society that we need to control these invasive plants. It's really important to clean your boots, your boat, your tires between sites. And also don't plant invasive plants. So some plants are for sale in nurseries like English ivy, for instance. So they're allowed to sell it, but maybe don't plant it just because it's being sold. And also plant native plants, especially ones that can outcompete invasive plants, especially after a disturbance. And removing invasive plants, it's really important to replant afterwards. And that's it. Thank you.